Margrave Leopold of Bavaria died with an arrow through his throat. He was on his knees in the mud beside the Danube River, choking on his own blood, watching his son take a second arrow through the face. Around him lay 300 of his best knights, dead or dying. Their armor didn't matter, their training didn't matter, the holy relics the priests carried didn't save them. And beyond the bodies, as far as anyone could see, the Hungarian horse archers just kept circling, firing, waiting. This wasn't a battle, it was an execution. 3 weeks earlier, Leopold had led 100,000 men into what is now Slovakia. It was the largest Christian army raised in Europe in nearly a century. Bavarians, Swabians, Franconians, knights in full mail, thousands of infantry, priests blessing their banners, supply wagons stretching back for miles. Their mission was simple: crush the Hungarian threat once and for all, march into their homeland, force them to fight, end the raids that had been bleeding Germany for a generation. They were confident, they were well armed, they had God on their side. By August 20th, 907, almost none of them were alive. Not captured, not ransomed, not scattered, dead. The Battle of Pressburg is one of the most catastrophic military disasters in European history, and most people have never heard of it. An entire generation of German nobility was wiped out in a single afternoon. Families that had ruled for centuries just vanished. The Carolingian Empire, already crumbling, collapsed completely. And the Hungarians, they didn't just survive, they dominated Eastern Europe for the next 50 years. But here's the thing, this wasn't some freak accident, this wasn't bad luck. The Germans walked straight into a trap, and once it closed, there was no escape. So, how does an army of 100,000 men, trained soldiers, experienced commanders, the best Europe had to offer, get completely annihilated by an enemy they thought they could crush? That's what we're here to find out. Before we get into it, I need to ask you something. If you want to see more stories like this, forgotten battles, brutal truths, the kind of history that doesn't get taught in school, please hit that like button and leave a comment. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who care about real history. And trust me, this story deserves to be remembered. Now, let me take you back to the year 900, back when Europe was fractured, terrified, and desperate. Back when Hungarian horse archers could appear out of nowhere, burn your village, take your family, and vanish before help arrived. And back to the moment when the most powerful men in Germany decided they'd had enough and marched an entire army to its death. This is the Battle of Pressburg, and this is how an empire ended in a single day. But to understand why 100,000 men marched to their deaths, you need to understand who they were marching against and why by the year 900 the Germans were willing to risk everything just to make them stop. The Hungarians, or as they were called then, the Magyars, were not European. They didn't fight like Europeans, they didn't think like Europeans, and that's exactly why they were winning. They came from the east, from the Central Asian steppes, where survival meant mastering the horse and the bow before you could walk. In 896, after being pushed out of their homeland by another nomadic group called the Pechenegs, 7 Magyar tribes, led by Prince Arpad, migrated into the Carpathian Basin, the flat open plains of modern-day Hungary. And from there, they started raiding. Not to conquer, not to hold territory, to take gold, livestock, captives, anything valuable. Then they'd disappear before anyone could respond. Their weapon of choice was the composite bow, smaller than the European longbow, but devastatingly effective. It could pierce chain mail at 200 paces, and because it was used from horseback, Magyar warriors could fire while moving at full speed. They perfected something called the Parthian shot, turning backward in the saddle while retreating and loosing arrows into pursuing enemies. European knights had never seen anything like it. A typical Magyar raid worked like this. A force of 500 to 2,000 horsemen would cross the border at night. By morning, they'd hit a monastery or a village. They'd kill anyone who resisted, take everyone else as slaves, load up on plunder, and ride out. If a local lord managed to gather his knights and give chase, the Magyars would simply outrun them. Their horses were smaller, faster, and bred for endurance. And if the knights got too close, the Magyars would wheel around, fire a volley of arrows, and watch the heavily armoured men fall from their saddles. Then they'd keep riding. Between 899 and 955, the Magyars launched over 50 major raids into Western Europe. They hit Italy, Germany, France, even Spain. They burned monasteries, sacked cities, and dragged thousands into slavery. Chronicles from the time describe them as a plague, a punishment from God, the end of the world made flesh. And the worst part, the Magyars weren't suffering. They were thriving. They'd settled into the Carpathian Basin permanently. They weren't nomads anymore. They were building a kingdom. They had farms, towns, and organized military structure. And the raids, those were just business, a way to fund their estate and keep their warriors sharp. By 906, the German nobility had endured nearly a decade of this, a decade of humiliation, a decade of paying tribute, a decade of failing to protect their own people. Something had to give. And then in the autumn of 906, something did. Duke Otto of Saxony, the man who would later become the father of the Holy Roman Empire, caught a Magyar raiding party off guard near the Unstrut River. His knights, fighting on favourable terrain with the element of surprise, crushed them.
Hundreds of Magyar warriors were killed. The plunder was recovered. It was the first real German victory in years. And suddenly, for the first time, the impossible seemed possible. Maybe the Magyars could be beaten. Maybe if the German dukes stopped fighting each other and actually worked together, they could end this nightmare once and for all. Maybe they could march into Hungary itself and destroy the threat at its source. That idea, that one intoxicating, dangerous idea, set everything in motion, and it led directly to Pressburg. But one victory wasn't enough to erase a decade of shame. Otto's triumph at the Unstrut River proved the Magyars could bleed. It didn't prove they could be destroyed. And there's a massive difference between ambushing a raiding party in your own territory and invading the heart of their kingdom. Still, the news spread fast. From Saxony to Bavaria, from Swabia to Franconia, the message rippled through the German lands. Otto did what no one else could. He stood his ground. He fought back. He won. And now the pressure was on everyone else to do the same. Because here's what most people don't understand about medieval politics. Honour wasn't just some abstract concept, it was currency. A duke's ability to protect his lands, to defend his people, to project strength, that determined everything. Whether lesser lords stayed loyal, whether the king took you seriously, whether you survived. And by 906, the German dukes had precious little honour left. Take Luitpold of Bavaria. He'd ruled the southeastern frontier for over a decade. His family, the Luitpoldings, had defended the Danube border since the time of Charlemagne. But what did he have to show for it? Burned villages, empty treasuries, a string of humiliating tribute payments just to buy temporary peace. Every time he handed gold to a Magyar chieftain, his own nobles watched, and every time he looked weaker. The church wasn't helping either. Archbishop Thietmar of Salzburg had been writing letters for years to the Pope, to other bishops, to anyone who would listen, begging for a coordinated Christian response. He framed the Magyar raids as a holy war, a test of faith. He argued that God was punishing Europe for its disunity and sin. And when Otto won at the Unstrut, Thietmar called it divine favour, proof that God would bless those who fought back. The pressure was building from every direction, religious, political, personal. But there was another factor, one that made invasion seem not just possible, but necessary. The Magyars were vulnerable. In 907, Prince Arpad, the legendary leader who had brought the Magyar tribes into the Carpathian Basin, was dead. His son Zsolt had taken over, but he was young, untested. There were rumours of internal disputes between the tribes. Some chieftains wanted to keep raiding, others wanted to settle down, build a proper kingdom, maybe even convert to Christianity and join European politics. From the outside, it looked like chaos, like opportunity. German scouts brought back reports. The Magyars were distracted, divided, unprepared for a major invasion. If the Germans struck now, hard, fast, with overwhelming force, they could catch them off guard. It was exactly what the dukes wanted to hear. So in the winter of 906, informal talks began. Messengers rode between courts. Duke Otto in Saxony, Margrave Luitpold in Bavaria, Duke Burchard in Swabia. Even King Louis the Child's advisors got involved, though the boy himself had no real say. The question wasn't whether to invade. It was how big the army needed to be. And the answer everyone arrived at was simple: as big as possible. Because this couldn't be another raid, another skirmish, another half measure. This had to be total overwhelming. The kind of military force that would crush the Magyar threads so completely they'd never dare raid German lands again. Luitpold would lead. He had the most experience fighting Magyars, and Bavaria shared the longest border with them. He knew the terrain, he knew the enemy. Archbishop Thietmar would march with them, turning the campaign into a holy crusade. That meant church resources, blessed banners, and the promise of spiritual rewards for those who fought. Every duchy committed troops, knights, infantry, supply wagons, siege equipment. By spring of 907, the word went out. All able-bodied warriors were to gather at Regensburg, the capital of Bavaria. From there they'd march down the Danube and into Hungarian territory. The goal was straightforward: destroy the Magyar settlements near Brezlasburg, force them into a pitched battle, and annihilate their army. If it worked, the raids would end. The German frontier would be secure, and most importantly, the dukes would prove they were still capable of defending Christendom. If it failed, well, no one seriously thought it would fail, not with the size of the army they were assembling. By early summer, the troops began arriving in Regensburg, knights in chainmail, some with full plate on their chests and shoulders, footmen with spears and shields, archers, engineers, blacksmiths, priests. Hundreds of supply carts loaded with grain, salted meat, barrels of water, arrows and replacement weapons. Camp followers, wives, servants, merchants swelled the numbers even further, and the army just kept growing. Chroniclers from the time struggled to give exact numbers, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. Modern historians place the force somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 men. For context, that's larger than the army William the Conqueror used to invade England in 1066, larger than most Crusader armies, one of the biggest military forces assembled in medieval Europe. It looked unstoppable. Luitpold stood before his commanders in the Great Hall of Regensburg and laid out the plan. March east along the Danube, secure the crossing at Brezlasburg, draw the Magyars into open battle, crush them. Archbishop Thietmar blessed the banners, priests held mass, prayers were sung for victory. And in late June 907, the army began to move. Thousands upon thousands of men, stretching for miles along the road, marching towards Hungary, marching to what they thought would be their greatest triumph. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that 150 miles to the east, Magyar scouts were already watching, and Prince Zsolt was smiling. The first week was almost festive. The column stretched so far you couldn't see the end of it. Knights rode in formation, their mail glinting in the summer sun. Infantry sang marching songs. Priests led prayers at every rest stop. The Bavarian nobles who'd spent years paying tribute to the Magyars now rode at the head of an army that could flatten cities. For the first time in a decade, they felt powerful. The route followed the Danube southeast through Bavaria and into what is now Austria. The road was well travelled, the terrain familiar. Villages along the way provided food and fresh water. Local lords came out to watch the army pass, some even pledging additional men. Luitpold rode near the front with his son Berthold and a core group of Bavarian commanders. Archbishop Thietmar travelled in a wagon surrounded by priests, occasionally stopping to bless the troops or deliver sermons about God's righteous wrath. Morale was high, confidence was higher. But by the second week, things started to change. The heat became unbearable. July in Central Europe is humid, oppressive, the kind of weather that turns armour into an oven. Men started shedding equipment. Water supplies ran low. The Danube was close, but the sheer number of troops made logistics a nightmare. You couldn't just let 100,000 men drink from the same section of river without chaos. Then there was the dust. With that many feet, hooves and wagon wheels moving along dirt roads, clouds of
dust hung in the air constantly. It coated everything. Got in your eyes, your mouth, your lungs. Soldiers at the back of the column had it worst. They marched through a perpetual brown haze. Discipline started to slip.
Fights broke out over rations. Some units fell behind. The supply wagons couldn't keep pace, but Luitpold pressed on. They were still in friendly territory. Once they crossed into Magyar lands, once they engaged the enemy, the discomfort would be worth it. By late July, they entered Lower Austria. And that's when things got strange. The villages were empty. Not abandoned in panic, just empty. No people, no livestock, homes intact but silent. Fields recently harvested, but no one around to enjoy the crop. It was as if entire communities had simply vanished. Luitpold sent scouts ahead. They reported the same thing for miles. Empty settlements, cleared granaries, roads with no traffic. The Magyars were gone. At first this seemed like good news. No resistance meant faster progress. Maybe the Magyars had heard about the size of the army and fled deeper into their territory. Maybe they were preparing to defend their heartland and had pulled everyone back. But some of the older commanders didn't like it. One of them, a grizzled Bavarian count named Dietmar, voiced what others were thinking. "They're watching us." Luitpold asked what he meant. "Think about it," Dietmar said. "We've been marching for weeks. We're deep in contested territory now, close to their lands, and we haven't seen a single Magyar scout, not one. Either they're blind, or they know exactly where we are and they're letting us come." Luitpold considered this. It was possible. The Magyars were expert horsemen and scouts, some of the best in the world. It would be strange if they didn't know about a 100,000-man army marching toward their homeland. But what was the alternative? Turn back because the enemy wasn't showing themselves? That would be humiliating. They'd come too far, committed too much, so they kept marching. By early August, the army crossed into the region near Brezalausperk, modern-day Bratislava, Slovakia. This was the target, a fortified Slavic settlement at the confluence of the Danube and Narava rivers. Intelligence reports said the Magyars had garrisoned it heavily. Taking it would give the Germans control of a key river crossing and force the Magyars to respond. But as the army approached, something felt off. The land was too quiet. No birds, no movement in the distant tree lines. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm. Scouts returned with mixed reports. Yes, Brezalausperk was defended. Magyar banners flew from the walls. But the garrison didn't seem large. A few hundred men, maybe 1,000. Nothing compared to what they'd expected. Where was the main Magyar army? Luitpold called another war council. His commanders were divided. Some argued they should take Brezalausperk quickly and then push deeper into Magyar territory to find the enemy. Others wanted to secure the settlement and wait, let the Magyars come to them. Archbishop Theodmar insisted they were overthinking it. "God has delivered the enemy into our hands," he said. "They flee before us like sheep before wolves. We take the fortress, we burn their lands, and we return home victorious." It was decided they would besiege Brezalausperk. On August 2nd, the German army took up positions around the settlement. Engineers began assembling siege equipment. Infantry dug trenches. Cavalry units patrolled the perimeter. And on August 3rd, they made their first probing attack. A force of Bavarian knights rode toward the main gate, testing the defences. The response was immediate. Magyar archers on the walls unleashed a storm of arrows. Several knights went down. Their horses screamed. The rest retreated behind their shields, pulling back out of range. The defenders weren't panicking, weren't calling for reinforcements. They were disciplined, organised, and confident. That night, Luitpold stood outside his tent, staring at the fires burning inside Brezalausperk. Around him, his own camp stretched for miles. Thousands of campfires, the sound of men talking, sharpening weapons, praying. He had the numbers, he had the equipment, he had God's blessing, according to Theodmar. So why did he feel like he'd made a terrible mistake? In the hills to the south, a Magyar scout sat on his horse, watching the German camp. He'd been there for hours, counting fires, estimating troop positions. When he'd seen enough, he turned his horse east and rode through the night. By morning, he was standing before Prince Zsolt, delivering his report. Zsolt listened carefully. Then he smiled. "Let them take the fort," he said. "Let them think they're winning." And then Zsolt's smile widened. "Then we kill them all." The siege lasted 12 days, and every single one of them should have been a warning. On August 4th, Luitpold ordered the siege engines into position. Catapults, battering rams, wooden towers tall enough to reach the top of the palisade walls. His engineers had built them specifically for this campaign, and they looked impressive lined up outside Brezalausperk. The bombardment began at noon. Stones the size of a man's head flew over the walls. Some struck buildings inside,
Others missed entirely, splashing into the Danube. The rams were wheeled forward under cover of shields, crews of 20 men pushing them toward the main gate. Magyar arrows rained down on them. Men dropped. The rams stalled. Infantry with shields rushed forward to protect the crews, forming a roof of wood and leather overhead. They pushed closer. The gate shook under the first impact, then the second, but it held. From the walls, the Magyar defenders moved with calm precision. They weren't panicking, weren't shouting, just reloading, aiming, firing. Their composite bows had a faster rate of fire than anything the Germans carried, and their accuracy was deadly. By nightfall, the Germans had lost 50 men and hadn't breached a single wall. Luitpold ordered the assault to continue the next day. August 5th was worse. The Magyars inside launched a sortie, a sudden counterattack. The gates opened just before dawn and 200 horsemen charged out, hitting the German siege lines before anyone was fully awake. They cut down sentries, set fire to one of the siege towers, and retreated back inside before the German knights could even mount their horses. It was over in minutes. Luitpold was furious, not just at the loss, but at how effortless it had been for them. These weren't desperate defenders making a last stand. They were playing with him. On August 6th, he ordered an all-out infantry assault. Ladders went up against the walls. Hundreds of footmen climbed, shields raised, trying to reach the top. Magyar defenders pushed the ladders back, poured boiling water, dropped stones. When men did manage to reach the battlements, they were cut down in seconds. The assault lasted 4 hours. By the end, the Germans had lost another 80 men. They still hadn't taken a single section of wall. That night, Luitpold met with his commanders. Archbishop Theodmar was there, still insisting that God would deliver victory if they had faith. But some of the other commanders were less certain. Count Dietmar spoke up again. "We've been here 6 days. We've lost over 100 men, and we're no closer to taking this fort than when we started. Meanwhile, where is the Magyar army?" "They're inside," one commander said. "No," Dietmar replied. "I mean the real army. We marched here expecting to face the full strength of Hungary. Instead, we're grinding ourselves against a wooden fort defended by a few hundred archers. Does that make sense to any of you?" Silence. Luitpold finally spoke. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting this is bait."
Another commander scoffed. "Bait? We have 100,000 men. Even if the entire Magyar nation showed up, we'd crush them in open battle." "Would we?" Dietmar asked. "Because we can't even take a fort." Luitpold shut the argument down. "We finish what we started. Tomorrow we hit them harder." But privately the doubt was growing. August 7th through August 11th blurred together. More assaults, more casualties. The siege engines battered the walls, but the Magyars repaired them every night. German soldiers began to grumble. The heat was unbearable. Supplies were running low. Feeding this many men in hostile territory was nearly impossible. Foraging parties had to go farther and farther to find food. And then, on August 12th, the scouts came back with news that changed everything. Magyar forces had been spotted not inside Breslausport, but outside to the south and east. Large groups, thousands of horsemen moving parallel to the German positions. They weren't attacking, just watching. Luitpold sent more scouts to get a better count. The reports that came back were alarming. At least 10,000 Magyar cavalry, possibly more, spread across the hills and forests surrounding the siege. They'd been there for days, maybe longer. One of the scouts said something that stuck with Luitpold. "They're not hiding, my lord. They're letting us see them." That night, the War Council reconvened. This time, the tone was different. "We are surrounded," Dietmar said flatly. "Not surrounded," another commander corrected. "They're keeping their distance. We could still retreat west if we had to." "For now," Dietmar replied. "But what happens when we do? You think they'll just let us walk back to Bavaria, or will they follow us and pick us apart piece by piece?" Archbishop Theodmar stood. "Enough. We came here to destroy the Magyar threat, and that's what we'll do. If they want to face us in open battle, then praise God, we'll give them the fight they deserve. Our knights will crush their horse archers. This is what we've been waiting for." Luitpold wasn't so sure, but Theodmar was right about one thing. They couldn't turn back now, not after coming this far, not after losing this many men for nothing. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, he ordered one final assault on Breslausport. Every available man, every piece of equipment, everything they had. It was brutal. Ladders, rams, arrows, men screaming, blood in the mud. But after hours of fighting, a section of the palisade finally gave way. German infantry poured through the gap, and by late afternoon, they'd taken the fort. The Magyar defenders withdrew across the Morava River and disappeared into the hills. The German soldiers raised their banners and cheered. Luitpold stood in the center of Breslausport and looked around. The settlement was half destroyed. His men were exhausted, bloody, demoralized. They'd lost nearly 300 soldiers taking a fort that was barely worth holding.
and outside in every direction, Magyar campfires were appearing on the horizon. He finally understood. This wasn't a siege, it was a delay. The Magyars had never intended to hold Pressburg. They'd used it to pin the German army in place, burn through their supplies, and exhaust their men. And now, with the Germans trapped deep in enemy territory, tired, hungry, and surrounded, now the real battle would begin. Luitpold gave his men 2 days to rest, 2 days to loot what little remained in Pressburg. The plan was to resupply from the surrounding countryside, then decide on the next move, push deeper into Magyar territory, or withdraw back to Bavaria with at least one victory to show for it. But on the night of August 17th, everything changed. The Magyar army moved. It happened in the dark. No horns, no war cries, just thousands of horsemen flowing across the landscape like water, silent and fast. They split into multiple groups, each with a specific objective. One force swept north, cutting off the road back to Bavaria. Another crossed the Danube to the south, blocking any retreat in that direction. A third moved east, positioning themselves between the Germans and the Hungarian heartland. By the time the sun rose on August 18th, the trap was complete. A German scout rode into camp just after dawn, his horse lathered and trembling. He went straight to Luitpold's tent. "They're everywhere," he said. Luitpold came outside. Other commanders gathered quickly. "What do you mean, everywhere?" The scout pointed north. "Magyar cavalry, thousands of them, maybe 2 miles out." Then he pointed south. "More there, then east, and there." Luitpold looked west, the direction they'd come from. "And behind us." The scout nodded. "Banners on every ridge." For a long moment, no one spoke. Count Dietmar broke the silence. "We are encircled." Archbishop Theodmar shook his head. "It's a show of force. They're trying to intimidate us. They won't actually attack. They've seen the size of our army." But Luitpold wasn't listening. He was doing the math in his head. His army was exhausted from 2 weeks of marching and 12 days of siege. Supplies were low, morale was fragile, and now they were surrounded by an enemy that had chosen the time and place for battle. Every advantage they'd started with was gone. He turned to his commanders. "Form a defensive square, infantry on the perimeter, cavalry in the center, supply wagons at the core, archers positioned to cover all sides. We hold formation and wait to see what they do." It was a sound tactic, the kind of formation that had broken cavalry charges for centuries. A tight, disciplined square was nearly impossible for horsemen to penetrate. But the Magyars weren't planning to penetrate it. By mid-morning, the first Magyar units appeared on the horizon. Not in a line, not in formation, just scattered groups of horsemen, maybe 30 or 40 in each, spread across a wide arc around the German position. They started circling, not charging, not closing the distance, just riding back and forth along the perimeter, staying about 300 paces out. Then the arrows started. The Magyars would ride past a section of the German line, each rider loosing 2 or 3 arrows as they passed, then wheel away before the Germans could respond. Then another group would come from a different angle and do the same. It was methodical, relentless, and devastatingly effective. Arrows fell into the German square like hail. Men raised their shields, but the sheer volume made it impossible to block everything. A soldier would cover his head and take an arrow in the thigh. Another would protect his body and get hit in the shoulder. Horses screamed and reared. Some broke free and bolted, trampling men in their panic. And the worst part, the Germans couldn't fight back, but their archers tried. They loosed volleys toward the circling Magyars, but the distance was too great and the targets were moving too fast. Most arrows fell short or wide. The few that did hit were absorbed by the Magyars' lighter armor or deflected by shields. Luitpold ordered a cavalry charge. If the Magyars wouldn't come to him, he'd go to them. A force of 500 Bavarian knights mounted up and charged northeast toward the nearest group of Magyar horsemen. The ground shook under the weight of their war horses, lances leveled, the kind of charge that had shattered infantry lines across Europe. The Magyars turned and rode away, just rode away. Their smaller, faster horses easily outpaced the heavily armored German knights. As they retreated, they used the Parthian shot, sheering backwards in their saddles and firing arrows into the pursuing Germans. Knights fell, horses collapsed. The charge lost momentum and finally stopped, the survivors milling around in confusion, too far from the main formation and too exhausted to keep chasing. That's when
the Magyars turned back. They swept in from 3 sides, firing at close range into the scattered German cavalry. It was slaughter. Men toppled from their saddles. Horses went down screaming. The survivors tried to retreat back to the square, and the Magyars harassed them every step of the way. By the time they made it back, they'd lost 50 men and accomplished nothing. Luitpold tried again. Different direction, same result, and again, and again. Each time the Magyars simply refused to engage. They'd retreat, circle, fire from distance. The German knights, weighed down by armor and exhausted from days of marching and fighting, couldn't keep up, and every charge left them more vulnerable, more spread out, more exposed. This went on all day.
By mid-afternoon, the German square was bristling with arrows, hundreds of them sticking out of shields, lodged in wagon wheels, embedded in the dirt. The ground around the formation was littered with German dead, men who'd been hit while trying to defend the perimeter or who'd fallen during the failed charges, and the Magyars barely had a scratch on them. As the sun began to set on August 18th, Luitpold stood in the centre of his formation and looked around. His men were exhausted, bleeding, demoralised. They'd been under constant attack for 10 hours and hadn't killed more than a handful of enemy fighters. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution in slow motion. Count Dietmar approached him, an arrow embedded in his shield, blood running down his arm from a graze wound. "We can't survive another day of this," he said quietly. Luitpold knew he was right. If they stayed here, the Magyars would simply keep circling, keep firing, until there was nothing left. They had one option: break out. Smash through the Magyar lines in one direction and make a run for Bavaria. It would be desperate, bloody. Hundreds, maybe thousands would die in the attempt, but it was the only chance they had. Luitpold called his commanders together and laid out the plan. At dawn, they'd form a spearhead, cavalry at the front, infantry behind, and charge west, back toward home, back toward safety. If they could punch through the encirclement and reach open ground, they might survive. If they couldn't, no one wanted to finish that sentence. That night, the German camp was silent, except for the sound of men praying. And out in the darkness, the Magyar campfires burned in a perfect circle, waiting. They moved before first light. Luitpold didn't want to give the Magyars time to see the formation and adjust. The plan depended on speed and shock. Hit hard, break through, keep moving. The cavalry formed up at the front, 2,000 Bavarian knights, the best Germany had. These were men who'd trained their entire lives for moments like this. Full mail armour, lances, swords, war horses bred for power and endurance. Behind them, the infantry formed into a tight column, 10 men wide, stretching back for half a mile. Spearmen, archers, engineers, camp followers, anyone who could walk. The supply wagons were abandoned. There was no time to bring them. No point, really. Either they'd break through and reach Bavaria in a few days, or they wouldn't reach it at all. Archbishop Theodmar stood at the front with a gilded cross, blessing the knights. Some men prayed, others checked their weapons one last time. A few just stared west, toward home, wondering if they'd ever see it again. Luitpold mounted his horse and rode to the head of the cavalry. His son Berthold was beside him, along with Count Dietmar and a dozen other Bavarian lords. No speeches, no grand declarations, just a simple order. When I give the signal, we ride. Don't stop for anything. If a man falls, leave him. If your horse goes down, get on another or run. We don't stop until we're through. He looked back at the column, thousands of faces staring at him in the pre-dawn glum. Then he raised his lance, spurred his horse, and charged. The thunder was deafening. 2,000 heavy cavalry moving at full gallop sounds like the end of the world. The ground shook, dust exploded into the air. The weight, the speed, the violence of it. This was what European warfare was built on. The Magyar forces in their path saw them coming, and they scattered. Just like before, they turned their horses and rode away, opening a gap in the encirclement. For a brief, glorious moment, it looked like the plan was working. The German cavalry punched through the line, and the infantry behind them surged forward, cheering. They were going to make it. Then the gap closed. From the north and south, thousands of Magyar horsemen converged on the German column, not on the cavalry at the front. They were already through. The Magyars hit the infantry in the middle. Arrows came from both sides at once. The column was packed so tightly that every arrow hit something, a man, a shield, another man behind him. People started dropping in clumps. The formation buckled. Units at the edges tried to turn and defend, but that just created more chaos. And the Magyars kept circling, kept firing. Luitpold, half a mile ahead with the cavalry, heard the screams and turned back. What he saw made his blood freeze. The column was disintegrating. The middle had fragmented into dozens of smaller groups, each surrounded by Magyar horsemen. Men were running in every direction. Some tried to form defensive clusters, others just fled. The Magyars pursued them all, riding them down, firing at point-blank range. Luitpold made a decision that would haunt his final moments.
He turned the cavalry around. "We go back," he shouted. "Protect the column." It was the noble thing to do, the honorable thing, the thing a leader was supposed to do. It was also suicide. The Bavarian knights wheeled their exhausted horses and charged back into the chaos. They tried to reach the infantry, tried to drive the Magyars off, tried to create space for the column to reform, but the Magyars wouldn't fight them. Every time the knights got close, the Magyars would pull back just out of reach, and when the knights turned to help another group, the Magyars would sweep back in and resume with firing. It was like trying to fight smoke. The German horses were done. They'd been ridden hard for weeks, underfed, overworked. Now, after a full gallop and multiple charges, they were stumbling, foaming at the mouth, some collapsing mid-stride, and the Magyars' horses were still fresh. By mid-morning, the German army had completely fallen apart. There was no column anymore, no formation, just thousands of men scattered across the plains, each group fighting its own desperate battle for survival. Some infantry tried to forge shield walls. The Magyars circled them and fired until there was nothing left standing. Some men threw down their weapons and tried to surrender. A few were taken as slaves. Most were killed where they knelt. Some ran for the Danube, thinking they could swim across. They drowned in their armor or were picked off by arrows while struggling in the water. And the knights, the elite warriors who were supposed to be invincible, were being hunted like animals. Small groups of Magyar horsemen would isolate a German knight, surround him, and fire from every direction until he went down. Then they'd move to the next one. Efficient, methodical, no wasted effort. Count Dietmar died trying to protect a group of fleeing infantry, an arrow through the neck. He fell from his horse and was trampled by his own men trying to escape. Duke Burkhard of Swabia made it almost a mile before his horse collapsed. He fought on foot for maybe 10 minutes before being overwhelmed. Luitpold's son, Berthold, took an arrow through the jaw, then another through the chest. He toppled sideways off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Luitpold saw him fall. He tried to reach him, tried to pull his
body onto his own horse, but the Magyars were everywhere now, closing in, and his remaining knights were pulling him back. "My lord, we have to go." But there was nowhere to go. By noon, the battle, if you could even call it that, was effectively over. The German army had been shattered into hundreds of small groups, most of them already dead or dying. The survivors were being hunted across miles of open terrain, with nowhere to hide and no hope of escape. And Luitpold, the man who'd led 100,000 warriors into Hungary with dreams of victory, was surrounded by maybe 300 knights near a bend in the Danube. Archbishop Theotmar was still with them, clutching his cross, covered in dust and blood. They dismounted. There was no point staying on the horses anymore. The animals were finished. The knights formed a circle, shields locked, weapons drawn, and the Magyars closed in. This was the end. They all knew it. No rescue was coming, no miraculous reversal, just arrows and blood, and the river behind them. Luitpold looked at the faces of the men around him, Bavarian lords, sons of noble families, men who trusted him, followed him, believed in him, and he'd led them all to their deaths. The first volley came a moment later. The arrows fell in waves, not wild, not panicked, precise and controlled. Like a craftsman working metal, the Magyar archers had done this 1,000 times. Sieges, ambushes, executions. This was just another day. The German shields took the first impacts. Wood splintered, some arrows punched clean through. Men grunted, shifted, tried to cover the gaps. Then the second wave hit. An arrow found the space between two shields and buried itself in a knight's shoulder. He staggered, but held his position. Another took an arrow through the thigh and dropped to one knee, still keeping his shield raised. Luitpold crouched behind his shield, feeling the impacts reverberate up his arm with each hit. His sword was drawn, but there was no one to fight, no enemy within reach, just the rain of arrows and the sound of men dying around him. Beside him, Archbishop Theotmar was praying loud enough to be heard over the chaos. Pater noster qui es in caelis, Our Father who art in heaven. An arrow hit the ground between them, then another didn't stop. Sanctifica tor nomen tuum, hallowed be thy name. One of the younger knights, a boy really, maybe 19, looked at Luitpold with wide, terrified eyes. "My lord, what do we do?" Luitpold didn't have an answer. What do you do when you're surrounded by an enemy you can't reach, can't fight, can't escape? When every tactical option has been exhausted and all that's left is the waiting? You die. But he didn't say that. Instead, he gripped the boy's shoulder. "Stay behind your shield, stay close, hold the line." The boy nodded.
30 seconds later, an arrow went through his neck. He collapsed without a sound. The circle was shrinking. Every minute another knight fell. Some died instantly. Others bled out slowly, groaning, trying to crawl towards the center of the formation before giving up and going still. Count Dietmar's brother, Ernst, took an arrow through the eye. He spun, dropped his shield, and fell forward. 2 other knights moved to cover the gap he left.
Then they fell, too. The Magyars weren't even hurrying. They had formed a loose circle about 100 steps out, rotating in shifts, so the arrows never stopped. Some would fire while others rested, then they'd switch. It was smart. They were patient. They had all day. Luitpold felt the arrow before he saw it, a sharp, burning pain in his left side, just below the ribs. He looked down and saw the stick sticking out of him. Blood was already soaking into his shirt. He pulled it out. That was a bad idea. Blood poured from the wound. He pressed his hand against it, trying to slow the bleeding, but it was no use. He dropped to one knee. Teotmar saw him and moved closer, still praying, still holding the cross. "My lord, don't stop," Luitpold said through clenched teeth. "Keep praying." Teotmar nodded and continued, "Forgive us our debts." Another arrow hit Luitpold in the shoulder, then another in the thigh. He tried to stay standing, but his strength was gone. He fell onto his side, the mud cold against his face. Around him, the last of his knights were falling. Some still fought, swinging swords at nothing, yelling challenges. Others just knelt, tired, waiting for the end. Teotmar stood in the center of what was left of the circle, holding the fancy gold cross above his head, like it could protect them all, but deliver us from evil. An arrow hit him in the chest. He stumbled, looked down at the stick sticking out from his ribs. Then he looked up at the cross in his hands, confused, as if wondering why God hadn't answered. A second arrow hit him in the stomach. He fell to his knees, still holding the cross, his lips still moving. Amen. Then he toppled forward into the mud, and the cross slipped from his hands. Luitpold watched him fall. His vision was getting blurry, his breathing shallow. He could feel his life draining out with every heartbeat. He thought about his wife, his daughters, the lands he'd ruled, the people he'd failed to protect. He thought about the 100,000 men he'd led here. Where were they now? Spread across miles of Hungarian fields, dead in the rivers, rotting in the sun, all because he'd believed they could win. The last thing he saw was the Danube River flowing past just a few feet away, calm, uncaring. Then an arrow hit him in the throat, and Margrave Luitpold of Bavaria, commander of the largest Christian army gathered in a generation, died in the mud of a foreign land. The Magyars waited until there was no more movement. Then they moved in. They stripped the bodies of armor and weapons. Anything valuable was taken: rings, coins, chainmail that wasn't too damaged. The rest they left. Some of the wounded Germans were still alive. A few were taken as slaves. The rest were killed. By mid-afternoon the site was silent, except for the occasional sound of a dying horse. The Magyars didn't celebrate. There was no party, no speeches. This wasn't a great victory. It was like pest control. They had gotten rid of a threat. Nothing more. Prince Sultan looked over the battlefield from his horse. Bodies everywhere. German flags stomped into the dirt. The Danube running red. One of his chiefs rode up next to him. Should we chase the ones who ran west? Sultan thought about it. There were small groups of Germans who had managed to slip away during the messy fighting. Maybe a few hundred, maybe less. Let them go, he said. Let them tell the story. Because that was the real weapon. Not the arrows, not the fighting moves. The story. The story of 100,000 men who marched into Hungary and never came home. That story would do more to protect Magyar lands than any army ever could. The chief nodded and rode off to give the order. Sultan took one last look at the horrible sight, then turned his horse east, back toward home, back to the Carpathian Basin, back to the kingdom they'd just secured with German blood. Behind him, the crows were already gathering. In the villages of Bavaria, they waited. August turned to September. The harvest came in. Life continued. But in every town, every settlement along the border, people watched the Eastern Road, waiting for the army to return, waiting for fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, waiting for news of victory. The first week, no one was worried. Wars took time. The army had only left in late June. Of course they weren't back yet.
The second week, people started asking questions. Had anyone heard news? Had any messengers come through? Nothing. By the third week, a quiet fear had settled over the region. Still no word, no messengers, no scouts, no riders bringing news of a great win, just silence. Then in early September, the first survivor stumbled into a village near Passau. He was on foot, no horse, no armor. His clothes were ripped and dirty. He had a wound in his side that had gotten infected, the flesh around it black and swollen. He collapsed at the village well and couldn't speak for an hour. When he finally could, he said 2 words. "They're gone." The villagers thought he was confused. Gone. What did that mean? Captured? Scattered? Dead? The man said, "All of them. Dead." They didn't believe him. Couldn't believe him. One man's wild talk didn't prove anything, but then another survivor arrived, then another, and another. Over the next 2 weeks, fewer than 100 men made it back to Bavaria. Most were foot soldiers who'd ran away during the escape and somehow managed to hide from the Magyar chasing them. A few were knights who'd thrown away their armor and horses and run. Every single one told the same story. Surrounded, killed, no chance, no mercy. The Margrave is dead. His son is dead. Archbishop Theodmar is dead. Duke Burkhard is dead. Count Dijkmar is dead. All the important leaders, all the commanders, all the priests, gone. And the soldiers, the 100,000 men who'd marched east in June, weren't captured, weren't held for money. They were simply dead, left to rot in Hungarian fields. The understanding spread like a sickness. In Regensburg, Luitpold's wife waited at the palace for weeks before accepting that her husband and son were never coming home. She collapsed when a servant finally brought her the news from the survivors. Within a year she was dead, some say from sadness, others from poison taken by her own hand. In villages across Bavaria and Swabia, families waited for men who would never return. A farmer's wife with 3 sons, all 3 had marched, none came back. A blacksmith who'd gone with his 2 brothers, gone. An entire generation of young men from some villages just wiped out. No bodies to bury, no graves to visit, just nothingness. Churches held services for the dead, but without bodies it felt empty. Priests didn't know what to say. How do you explain a disaster this complete? How do you comfort a kingdom that just lost an entire army? Some called it God's punishment, others called it being betrayed. Rumors spread that the Magyars had used magic, or that someone in the German command had sold them out. But the truth was simpler and scarier. The Germans had been outfought, outsmarted, destroyed by an enemy they had not taken seriously. And now that enemy was stronger than ever, because the Magyars didn't stop. Why would they? In 908, they launched the largest attack yet into Bavaria. There was no army left to stop them. They burned through the countryside, taking whatever they wanted. Some towns paid money right away, not even bothering to fight. Luitpold's replacement, Duke Arnold, tried to organize a defense, but he didn't have the men or the supplies. Most of Bavaria's military strength had died at Pressburg. The remaining nobles were too weak, too divided, too scared. So Arnold did the only thing he could. He talked things out. He offered the Magyars regular money payments in exchange for peace. Basically, he made Bavaria a state that paid tribute. The same thing happened across Germany. Without a unified military plan, without strong leaders, the smaller states fell into confusion. Some nobles tried
to grab power. Others just tried to survive. And in 911, 4 years after Pressburg, King Louis the Child died. He was 18 years old. Some records say illness, others hinted poison, political enemies taking advantage of the confusion. With his death, the Carolingian dynasty in Germany ended. The empire Charlemagne had built, the legacy that had defined Europe for 100 years, was finished. What came next was a power struggle. Dukes fought each other for control. The church struggled to maintain any kind of order, and the Magyars kept raiding year after year after year. For the next 50 years, they would terrify Central Europe. Historians later called them the Scourge of God. They raided as west as France, as far south as Italy, as far north as Saxony, and no one could stop them, because everyone remembered what happened the last time someone tried. Pressburg became a scary story, a warning, a curse. Don't march east, don't fight the Magyars on their land, don't believe you can win just because you have the bigger army. It wasn't until 955, 48 years after Pressburg, that a German leader finally defeated the Magyars in an open battle. His name was Otto the Great, the son of Duke Otto of Saxony, the same Otto who'd won that small victory at the Unstrut River back in 906, the victory that had inspired the whole terrible plan. Otto crushed the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld. It was complete, decisive, and it ended the raids forever. That victory made him a legend. 3 years later, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, starting a family line that would last 1,000 years. But that victory came at a cost that's often forgotten. Before Lechfeld, there was Pressburg. Before the empire was reborn, it had to die, and 100,000 men paid the price. So, what actually happened at Pressburg? Not just the fighting, we've covered that, but what about the bigger picture? Why did this battle matter so much that it changed the entire political landscape of Central Europe for half a century? Because it showed something the German nobles didn't want to admit. Their way of war was old-fashioned. European warfare in the 900s was built around heavy cavalry, knights in chainmail armor, fighting in groups, charging with long spears. It was very strong against foot soldiers. It was perfect for planned battles on open fields. It had won wars for generations, but it had big weaknesses. Heavy cavalry was slow. It needed massive support for food and supplies. It couldn't chase a faster enemy, and it was completely useless against opponents who refused to stand still and fight. The Magyars understood this. They'd fought Chinese armies, Turk tribes, Persian forces, opponents who knew how to defeat heavy cavalry. So when they faced the Germans, they didn't try to fight them head-on. They just didn't play the same game. They used speed, distance, the land, time. They turned the Germans' greatest strength, their numbers and armor, into a problem because 100,000 men in enemy land need food, water, supply lines, rest. The bigger the army, the harder it is to keep going. And when that army is tired, trapped, and losing hope, it doesn't matter how good the individual soldiers are. Pressburg was a masterpiece in fighting differently, and it taught Europe a lesson that took decades to learn. Size doesn't guarantee victory. Tactics do. Supplies do. Understanding your enemy does. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. The Magyars didn't win because they were lucky. They won because they were patient. Think about the timeline. They could have attacked the German army while it was marching through Lower Austria. They could have defended the fort at Pressburg with all their men and fought a normal siege battle. But they didn't. They let the Germans march deep into enemy land. They let them waste 2 weeks and 300 men on a useless fort. They waited until the Germans were tired, low on supplies, and far from help. Then they struck. That kind of self-control is rare. It needs leaders who can control thousands of warriors and keep them from fighting too early. It needs confidence that your plan will work, even when the enemy looks unbeatable. Prince Sultan had that confidence, and it paid off. After Pressburg, the Magyars were untouchable. For 50 years, no European power dared launch a major attack against them. They raided freely, collected money from many kingdoms, and slowly changed from a wandering group into a settled kingdom. By the year 1000, Hungary was a Christian state under King Stephen III. They'd gone from a major threat to a real European power. And it all started with the dead bodies of 100,000 Germans left to rot in Slovakian fields. Now, here's the question I want you to think about. Could Pressburg have been avoided? Not the battle itself. Once the armies were in position, the result was probably certain. But the entire trip, the decision to invade in the first place. What if Luitpold had said no? What if he'd refused the pressure from the church, from the other dukes, from his own pride, and said, "This is a bad idea. We don't have the supplies, we don't understand their fighting moves, we're not ready." Would he have been called a coward? Absolutely. Would other nobles have questioned his leadership? Probably. But would 100,000 men still be alive? Yes. That's the painful math of Pressburg. Pride and political pressure killed more men than Magyar arrows ever could. And here's the thing. We see this pattern happen again throughout history. Leaders who make terrible decisions not because the plan makes sense, but because they can't afford to look weak. Campaigns launched not because victory is likely, but because giving up feels like losing. Pressburg wasn't just a military disaster. It was a failure of good judgment at the very top. And the cost was an entire generation. Families destroyed, bloodlines ended, villages left without young men to work the fields or defend the borders. An empire that collapsed because it lost the one thing holding it together, military strength. The German states didn't get better until Otto the Great came along 50 years later. And when he finally defeated the Magyars at Lechfeld, he did it with a smaller, faster force. He used different kinds of fighters working together, cavalry and foot soldiers. He studied Magyar moves and changed his own. He learned the lessons Luitpold never got the chance to. And that's why Pressburg matters. Not just because 100,000 men died, but because their deaths taught Europe how to survive. The Holy Roman Empire that Otto started, the empire that would control Central Europe for 1,000 years, was built on the remains of Pressburg. Every change in fighting, every big-picture adjustment, every political consolidation that made that empire possible came from realizing that the old ways didn't work anymore. Pressburg was the end of one time and the beginning of another. And the men who died there, whether they knew it or not, were the price of that change. So the next time you hear about a minor medieval battle that no one remembers, ask yourself, how many lives did it cost? How many families were destroyed? How did it change the world? Because history isn't just dates and names.
It's people, decisions, consequences, and sometimes those consequences reshape entire civilizations. If this story made you think, if it changed how you see history even a little bit, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so we can keep digging up these forgotten moments and bringing them back to life. And here's my final question for you. If you were advising Leopold in 906, after Otto's victory at Unstrut, knowing what the Magyars were capable of, would you have told him to invade, or would you have found another way? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's talk about it, because the dead of Pressburg can't speak for themselves anymore, but we can speak for them. But we need to talk about the ones
who lived, because while most of the army died at Pressburg, a few hundred men did make it home, and their stories reveal something the official histories don't. What it actually felt like to survive when everyone around you was dying. The survivors weren't heroes, they weren't celebrated. Most of them were broken, deeply upset men who'd watched their friends get killed and had run to save their own lives. And when they got back to Bavaria, no one knew what to do with them. One of the few detailed reports we have comes from a Bavarian foot soldier named Ottmar. His story was written down by a monk at Regensburg Abbey several months after the battle. It's one of the only first-hand descriptions of Pressburg that survived. Ottmar was part of the foot soldier group during the escape on August 20th, when the Magyar forces hit the group from both sides. His unit fell apart within minutes. He described it like this: "The arrows came so thick you couldn't see the sky. Men fell in piles. I saw my brother take one through the stomach. He called for me, but I kept running. God forgive me. I kept running." Ottmar threw away his spear, his shield, everything that would slow him down. He ran west, away from the killing field, through fields and forests. He hid in a riverbed for an entire day while Magyar scouts rode past. At night he moved again. He walked for 2 weeks, ate roots, drank from streams, avoided roads. When he finally crossed back into Bavaria near Passau, he was confused from fever and starving. The monk who wrote down his story noted that Ottmar cried through most of the interview. He kept repeating the same thing: "I left my brother. I left him." That kind of guilt was common among the survivors. Another man, a Saxon knight named Gerald, made it back with 3 arrow wounds and no horse. He had lost his armor, his sword, everything valuable. When he reached his family estate, his wife didn't recognize him at first. He'd aged 20 years in 2 months. Gerald never spoke about what happened, not to his family, not to the church, not to anyone. He spent the rest of his life, another 12 years, in almost complete silence. When he died in 919, his wife found a diary hidden in his belongings. Inside was a single note written shortly after his return. "We were told we would bring glory to God and empire. We brought only death. I watched nobles die like dogs. I watched priests beg for mercy they didn't receive. And I ran. I am alive because I am a coward. May God judge me for it." The survivors carried more than just cuts and bruises. They carried the knowledge that everything they'd believed about German military strength was a lie. And when people asked them what happened, how an army of 100,000 could be destroyed so completely, they struggled to explain it. Because it wasn't one giant, terrible moment. It was 1,000 small decisions that added up to a disaster. Marching too deep into enemy land, wasting supplies on a useless siege, not taking the enemy seriously, breaking formation during the retreat. Every mistake cost lives, and by the end there were no lives left to spend. Some survivors tried to warn others, tried to explain that the Magyars fought differently, that normal fighting moves didn't work, that the next campaign, if there was one, needed to be planned completely differently. But no one wanted to hear it. Admitting that would mean admitting that Leopold, Archbishop Thietmar, and all the other dead nobles had made deadly mistakes in judgment, that they'd led men to their deaths through being too proud and poor planning. So instead, the story became, the Magyars used magic, they were evil spirits, God was testing us. It was easier to blame supernatural forces than accept that the Germans had simply been outfought. A few survivors couldn't live with that. In 910, 3 years after Pressburg,
a former Bavarian knight named Reinhard hanged himself in his family church. He left a note that said only, "I see their faces every night. I cannot carry this anymore." Another survivor, a Swabian nobleman named Conrad, became a monk and spent the rest of his life copying books in silence. When asked why he joined the monastery, he said, "Because I have nothing left to say to this world." But not all the survivors were broken. Some became advisors, quiet voices in the background of military planning sessions, warning younger commanders about the dangers of being too confident. When Duke Arnold talked about tribute payments with the Magyars in 908, several Pressburg survivors were in the room. They knew what would happen if he tried to fight instead. And when Otto the Great finally prepared to face the Magyars at Lechfeld in 955, he talked with the few aging survivors still alive. By then they were old men, 60, 70 years old, but their memories were sharp. They told him, "Don't chase them. Don't break formation. Don't let them separate your forces. And whatever you do, don't underestimate them." Otto listened, and he won. So, in a strange way, the survivors of Pressburg did serve a purpose. Not as heroes, not as symbols, but as warnings, living reminders of what happens when pride replaces strategy. Most of them died forgotten. No statues, no songs, just names in monk records and fading memories. But their stories, what little survived, give us something the official histories can't. The human cost of Pressburg wasn't just 100,000 dead. It was the hundreds who came back and spent the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't, carrying the weight of survival when everyone around them had fallen. That's the part of history no one talks about, the ones who lived and couldn't forgive themselves for it. Here's something that should bother you. One of the largest military disasters in medieval European history happened near modern Bratislava, Slovakia. 100,000 men died there. The battlefield should be huge, scattered with objects, bones, weapons, evidence. But we can't find it. Archaeologists have been searching for decades. They know the general area, somewhere near where the Danube and Morava rivers meet, close to where the old settlement of Pressburg stood. But the exact spot of the killing ground, the site where Leopold made his last stand, the fields where thousands of foot soldiers were cut down, is gone. Not hidden, not buried deep, just gone. And there's a reason for that. The Magyars didn't leave the bodies where they fell. That would have been a silly move strategically. A field full of 100,000 dead bodies becomes a source of disease within days. Sickness, contaminated water sources. It would have threatened their own settlements. So they dealt with it. Some bodies, especially the nobles in expensive armor, were stripped and left for animals to eat. Wolves, birds. Within weeks, nature took care of the remains. Other bodies were likely burned in big piles. The Magyars had experience with this from fighting in the steppes, where getting rid of enemy dead quickly was normal practice. The weapons, armor, and equipment were reused. Chainmail could be melted down, swords fixed, shields burned for fire. Anything valuable was taken back to Magyar settlements and added to their own military supplies. Within months, the battlefield was just empty fields again. No markers, no graves, no memorials. The Magyars had no reason to remember a German defeat, and the Germans, they wanted to forget it had ever happened. But here's what's even stranger. For centuries, Pressburg was barely mentioned in Western European documents. The histories that do talk about it, mostly written by monks in Bavaria and Saxony, give very little detail. A few sentences, maybe a paragraph, nothing compared to how they covered other battles from the same time. Why? Because Pressburg was embarrassing. Medieval writers worked for nobles and kings. Their job was to record history in a way that made their employers look good. Victories were described in detail. Troop movements, brave charges, God's help. Defeats
were played down or blamed on outside reasons, but Pressburg was too big to ignore and too terrible to make sound good, so they just didn't talk about it. Some histories mention a great battle in the east or a defeat against the Hungarians without saying more. Others skip from 906 directly to 908 as if 907 didn't happen. The most detailed report we have comes from the Annals of Alemanni, written in Swabia. In the year 907, Margrave Luitpold and Archbishop Theotmar, with many nobles of Bavaria, fell in battle against the Hungarians. The loss was greater than any in living memory. That's it. 28 words to describe the deaths of 100,000 men.
Compare that to the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, which gets pages of description. Otto's smart thinking, the bravery of the knights, God's favour shining on the Christians. The difference? Lechfeld was a victory, Pressburg was a disaster, and nobody wanted to remember it. Over time, as the decades passed and the survivors died, even the memory started to fade. By the thousands, most Germans only had a vague idea that something bad had happened near Hungary 100 years ago. By the 1100s, it was almost completely forgotten. It wasn't until modern historians started comparing Hungarian and German documents in the 1800s and 1900s that the full size of Pressburg became clear. Hungarian histories written centuries later, after Hungary had become a Christian kingdom, mentioned the battle as a major turning point. They described it as the moment when Magyar control over Central Europe was secured. Some even made the numbers bigger, claiming 200,000 Germans had died. When modern scholars compared the sources, they realized something horrifying. This wasn't just a forgotten battle, it was an erased one, intentionally hidden by the people who lost it and celebrated only by the people who won until they converted to Christianity and stopped wanting to brag about killing Christian armies. So Pressburg fell into a historical gap, too embarrassing for the Germans to remember, too pagan for the Christian Hungarians to celebrate. And that's why even today, most people have never heard of it. If you go to Bratislava now, there are no statues for the battle, no museums dedicated to it. A few local historians know the story, but it's not part of the national story for Slovakia, Austria, or Hungary. The modern city sits right on top of what was once a killing field, and almost no one knows. There's a small sign near the old castle, put up in 2007 on the 1100th anniversary of the battle. It's in Slovak, German, and Hungarian. Most tourists walk right past it. The sign reads, "Near this site in 907, a great battle was fought between the armies of East Francia and the Magyar tribes. The Frankish forces, led by Margrave Luitpold of Bavaria, were defeated. The consequences of this battle shaped the history of Central Europe for centuries. Simple, polite, cleaned up. Nothing about 100,000 dead. Nothing about the collapse of the Carolingian dynasty. Nothing about the 50 years of Magyar raids that followed. Just a great battle was fought. And that, in a way, is the final insult. The men who died at Pressburg, who marched east believing they were defending Christianity, who fought and bled and died in the mud, don't even get a proper memorial. Their bones are gone, their names forgotten, their sacrifice erased. All that's left is the story and the lesson, which brings us to the real question. Why does any of this matter now, over 1,000 years later? Because the mistakes that killed those 100,000 men are still being made today. Not on medieval battlefields, but in company meeting rooms, in government offices, in military command centres. The core failure at Pressburg wasn't about fighting moves, it was about how they thought. Luitpold believed that because his army was bigger, because his knights had better gear, because his cause was right, victory was guaranteed. He ignored intelligence reports, dismissed warnings, kept going when the evidence suggested running away. Sound familiar? In 1961, the United States launched the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. The CIA assured President Kennedy it would work because American trained forces were superior. It failed terribly because they'd underestimated Castro's military and overestimated local support. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq with the belief that superior weapons and technology would guarantee a quick victory. The fighting that followed lasted over a decade. In business, we see the same pattern. Companies ignore market signs, keep funding failing plans, assume their size will protect them, then they collapse. Blockbuster, Kodak, Nokia. The lesson of Pressburg isn't just about medieval warfare, it's about being overly proud, about what happens when leaders confuse feeling sure with being good at something, when they surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear, instead of what they need to know. Count Dietmar warned Luitpold multiple times,
The scouts reported Magyar forces getting ready to surround them. The siege was draining supplies and doing nothing. Every warning sign was there, and Leupold ignored them all, because turning back would have looked weak. That's the real killer, not Magyar arrows. Pride, the unwillingness to admit a mistake, the fear of looking uncertain, the belief that retreating means failure. So Leupold kept pushing forward, and 100,000 men paid for it. Now ask yourself, how many modern leaders make the same choice? How many CEOs keep funding a failing project because admitting failure would hurt their reputation? How many politicians increase conflicts because backing down would cost them votes? How many managers push their teams harder instead of admitting the strategy isn't working? The circumstances change, the technology changes, but human nature stays the same. And that's why studying history matters. Not to memorize dates, not to win trivia contests, but to recognize patterns, to see when you're making the same mistakes people made 1,000 years ago. Because if you think you're safe from the kind of thinking that killed 100,000 men at Pressburg, you're already halfway to making the same mistake. Here's another reason Pressburg matters. It shows how quickly control can collapse. In 906, Germany was the major military power in Central Europe. The Carolingian Empire was weak, but still together. German armies had decades of experience and the best equipment. 1 year later, that was all gone. The empire collapsed. The military was shattered. Regional powers filled the gap. 50 years of confusion followed. One battle, one terrible mistake, and everything changed. We see this throughout history. Rome didn't fall slowly. It collapsed in stages, often triggered by single disastrous battles. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD broke Roman military power in the east. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 ended Byzantine control in Anatolia. Modern superpowers aren't safe from this. The Soviet Union looked unbeatable in the 1980s. Within a decade, it was gone. Not because of a military defeat, but because the basic structure was weaker than it seemed. Pressburg is a reminder that strength is fragile. Empires are fragile. The things we assume are permanent can disappear faster than we think. And when they do, the people on the ground, the soldiers, the ordinary citizens, the families pay the price. That's the part that gets lost in discussions about big world politics and grand strategy. We talk about nations rising and falling like it's just an idea, like it's just lines on a map shifting. But behind every line is a person. Behind every death number is a family that lost someone, a village that lost its young men, a wife who waited for a husband who never came home. The 100,000 at Pressburg weren't just soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, tradesmen, men with families with lives they expected to return to. And they died because leaders made bad decisions in rooms those
men were never allowed into. That's the final reason Pressburg matters. It's a reminder that leadership has consequences. When you make decisions that affect thousands of lives, you don't get to simply forget the mistakes. You don't get to say, well, we tried our best. Leupold led those men into Hungary. He made the call to lay siege to the fort at Pressburg. He ordered the escape attempt. And when it all fell apart, he died with them, which is the only honourable thing he did in the whole trip. But his death doesn't excuse him. It doesn't erase the fact that most of those 100,000 deaths were preventable. Better intelligence, better planning, better supplies, a willingness to retreat when the situation turned bad, any of those could have saved thousands of lives. Leaders today have the same responsibility. Whether you're running a country, a company, or a small team, your decisions spread outward. The people affected by those decisions trust that you've thought it through, that you've considered the risks, that you're not just guessing based on ego and hoping for the best. And when leaders fail that responsibility, people suffer. That's not a comforting truth, but it's a true one. And it's why history isn't just about the past, it's about right now. Every time a leader faces a choice between admitting error and keeping on, every time someone ignores warnings because they don't fit the story they want to believe, every time pride overrides good sense, those are Pressburg moments. And the question is, will we recognize them before it's too late? Or will we do what Leupold did, keep marching east ignoring every warning sign until there's no way back. The men who died at Pressburg can't answer that question, but we can, and that's why their story, forgotten, erased, ignored for centuries, still matters, because the lessons written in their blood are lessons we still need to learn. So here's what I want you to take from this. Next time you see a leader keep going with a bad decision, remember Pressburg. Next time you see someone ignore warnings because they're too proud to change course, remember Pressburg. And next time someone tells you that history doesn't matter, that the past is irrelevant, that we're too advanced to repeat old mistakes, remember 100,000 men who marched into Hungary and never came home.